So, who has seen the training we did for parents back in October? Okay, all right. So those of you who didn't raise your hands, the next few slides are going to be really confusing. That's okay. That's okay. Because after today, you can go and look at that slideshow, and then come back to this confusing part, and it'll make total sense. Okay. So the first parent training was in October last year, and a lot has happened. Right. In October, we were at school. As of February 2nd, we're not just a school, we're a mission, right? And the size of that mission is big, Orange County. So this presentation is going to pick up more or less where we left off last time, but with that particular new situation in mind. So Ben, go ahead and go to full screen. So, those of you who did see the presentation last October, does this man look familiar? Okay. This man's name was Gorgias, and he was one of the antagonists in a Platonic dialogue by the name of Gorgias. All right. Gorgias made a lot of money teaching students, and he and Socrates got into this very interesting debate about what is ultimately the purpose of education. Right? This kind of has relevance for us. It was Gorgias who argued to Socrates that education was about teaching students how to persuade people to do what they want them to do. Right? To use language to manipulate people. All right? And of course, this was ironic, historically speaking, because what was Gorgias known for? Good. He was known for this. Gorgias was central in persuading the city-state of Athens to enter into a conflict with Syracuse that was so catastrophically bad that more than likely paved the way for Athens' defeat at the hands of Sparta, and therefore eventually Athens' downfall. So when Socrates responds to Gorgias in the dialogue, he responds with this question. But without wisdom, how do you know what you want people to do is really wise? Can you see what Plato is telling us when he's writing this dialogue? What Plato is telling us, now Plato isn't writing this dialogue, okay? He's telling us that unless we attend to wisdom, we are all like Gorgias, using our education as a tool to get things without ever considering whether what we think we may be getting will get us any closer to the things we should actually want. The world is not what it seems, and some have made their lives comfortable with the way that it seems. And as was the case for Gorgias and the Athenians, to live this way, Plato tells us, has consequences. So what is the secret of wisdom to do? Well, Plato in his Republic gives us an immensely helpful parable to illustrate the process by which we may become wise. You could say it is a story in 5 parts. It begins with the way things seem, and how just a tap on the shoulder can startle our hero to wake up and realize he's been fooled, to think shadows that are before him on a wall are reality. Then with the help of a teacher, he's guided out of what turns out to be a cave, and then having seen the world for what it is, he goes back into the cave to help others out of the cave. This is the cycle of teaching classically understood. We are first helped out of the cave of appearances, then we help others out of the cave of appearances. And how do we do this? By entering into that great conversation going back to ancient Greece and Jerusalem, and continuing all the way to this day in schools like OCCA. What does a school look like that helps equip its students to enter into this 2,500 year-long tradition of wisdom and virtue and to live it out? What are we building here at OCCA that can recover the true mission of education for our kids? Well, that was when we were introduced in that training to Miss Dorothy Sayers, who reintroduced the world to the principles of trivia, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And we learned how subsequent research since her essays vindicated her argument that the best way to educate the young is to begin with teaching basic facts, grammar, followed by the underlying logical relationships between those facts, logic, followed by rhetoric, which is when the student becomes sufficiently learned in the facts and logical structure of the subject matter that they are now able to synthesize their own contributions from different sources by virtue of being able to understand the subject matter and its internal work. And in order to optimize subject matter mastery, found school curriculum must be ordered around these three guiding principles. And a key point to this is the key point, is that the nature of how a given subject matter must be taught must reflect the underlying logical structure of that subject being taught. So this looks different for different subjects. And we learned in that training how this is revealed by how we teach the humanities, mathematics, and the sciences. In this case, biology in particular. In all these disciplines, each stage advances cumulatively in sophistication and detail based on fundamentals established in the previous stage. And I could go into detail here about our phonics and literacy program, our writing program. Interestingly, they all follow the same logic, but the structure is an expression of the inner nature of that particular discipline. It's a very interesting exercise sitting on the trains and realizing, oh, right, explicit phonics, which is literacy essentials. Really, it's just the trivium of reading and spelling. Our writing program from the Institute of Excellence Writing, very similar approach, but each is different because the subject is different. And this is a very key principle guiding all of our curricular forms. As parents who grew up in public education like I did, a lot of this stuff looks strange. So the Singapore math is a classic example. It turns out, however, it's very effective if you're a second grader. It's hard to understand if you're an adult. The challenge is having teachers who are sufficiently capable in Singapore math or phonics to be able to do that teaching. If you have that, you start to see the outcomes that we saw and are seeing in the school. Right? It's a very challenging thing to achieve, but when you achieve it, it shows up in student outcomes. And that's something we saw from last year, and we talked about that on occasion. If you want to know more about that, let me know, because among my jobs is diving into that data. And it's very exciting when you actually look at some of the breakdowns in terms of demographics and how we just really outperform our neighbors in OUSD. All right, so a classical school like ours is where our students grow in the necessary knowledge and sophistication in their first 9 years so that when they enter freshman year, all right, they are ready to enter deeply into the great conversation. We use the wisdom of trivium to prepare our students for entering into that wisdom dialectic with the great wisdom tradition. And the reason why it is critical that it happens this way is because we now know it's in this high school years. Go ahead, Ben. Ben's multitasking. There you go. It's in these high school years that students are entering a defining moment of self-formation. Specifically, psychologists now recognize that the years 15 to 25 are absolutely key formative period for students' identity and character, where they begin working out themes of self-identity that are autobiographical. That is, when they start forming a sense of themselves as a character in a narrative that gives them an understanding of who they are, how they came to be, and where they are going. And where are they receiving these narratives that help to inform their identity? Whatever the culture around them gives them. The high school years are exactly the time when kids are hungry for the kind of formative narratives which education should provide, but can only be available to them if they possess the kind of mastery of knowledge and language that a classical K sequence provides. As students go through the final 4 years of Orange County Classical Academy, they will read the classics from ancient Greece and Jerusalem and Rome to the modern world, but in such a way that what the student will take from those years will be formative in the full sense, by providing those ideas and exemplars to a young person at a time they are hungriest for such examples as they form who they are and what they will become. This is where the student enters into the great conversation, made possible precisely because we've been equipping them with the necessary tools for the previous 9 years in K through 8, just like the trivia describes. This is the image that you're seeing right here that encapsulates what we're talking about when we talk about a school that teaches wisdom and virtue. It contains the key elements, the content-rich and coherent curriculum that builds literacy, which allows for the tools for rich engagement with the wisdom tradition. It helps form the core identity of our students. So based off this material, if I were to offer you a definition of classical education, I would define it simply as education in wisdom and virtue. However, thanks to Aristotle, we can expand that definition by using his definition of wisdom and make it far richer. Go ahead. Classical education is education in the life lived according with the true and the good and the virtues to pursue them. It's not the true and the good, it's not knowledge of the true and the good, it's knowledge of a life lived in accordance with the true and the good and the virtue to pursue them. It's not just a knowing, it's a doing. All right? Very key. This isn't theoretical, it's practical. That's what makes it virtue. If there's a problem statement to realizing that vision, I would argue it's the following. How do we make ambition and desire, how do we make ambition, desire to seek wisdom and virtue, as opposed to, say, the sophistries of our own age? How do we guide our students to seek Socrates over Gorgias? The answer to that question is to teach in such a way as to disclose the innate beauty of the life lived in accordance with the true and the good. Why such a life is in fact desirable for its own sake. In other words, the answer, in short, is beauty. And this is what is taking place in a classical charter school that is fulfilling its mission with ever increasing sophistication and mastery until upon graduation our students are equipped to carry on that mission into their young adult lives. All right, so are there any questions before we proceed? All right, because we've now followed the review. Yes?
copy of the PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I could do that. Great question. All right, so we're good? All right, so now this is all new material. So if that stuff was a little confusing, go back to the October presentation, and it goes over that in great detail, all right? All right, so onward to virtue. Go ahead. All right. So our first presentation was about what wisdom and virtue look like from the outside. Today's is about what it looks like from the inside. We are going to do an introspective dive into the main challenges to this way of life and what navigating those challenges looks like. What kind of challenges? Well, there is a part of our nature within ourselves that resists wisdom and virtue. Go ahead and get the next one. There is the world we live in that resists wisdom and virtue. And then there is this whole business of learning just what wisdom and virtue are. And how exactly do we even begin to realize it in our lives and in the world? So fortunately for us, we have preserved for our time answers to all these questions in one of the greatest works of moral philosophy, Aristotle's Nikolakian Ethics. First, the resistant nature in ourselves. According to Aristotle, we are like a charioteer trying desperately to master two warring forces in our life. A willful but spirited force, thumos, that's interesting, right? Thumos, and a compliant force, but compliant only to that which gives it honors and status, timia. So, question. Do you see much thumos and timia in your kids? I suspect so. Perhaps more of one than the other. All right. As your students' charioteers, or are your students' charioteers very good at reining them in? Yeah. Well, the elementary kids probably not. And that's because, according to Aristotle, training the charioteer, the rational part of your nature, is the job of education. We are teaching aspiring but amateur charioteers how to not only master their two warring forces, but also how to get the most out of them. That's a key point. This is important because as educators, for us, we're all looking at that thumatic kid in the classroom and thinking, you know, this wasn't a class in school, thinking that this kid must be hopeless because he's a little too spirited or uncontrollable. But according to Aristotle, that's not true. Spiritedness is a good thing. I feel that way sometimes, but I'll give you the book, it's actually pretty good. If our school succeeds in its mission, that unruly spirited kid will learn how to get the most out of that spirit of his to serve worthy ends. And the same goes for the Timian kid, all right? In the front row class, desperately raising their hand to get praise from the teacher, all right? We've seen both of these, sometimes the same kid. So how do you train a charioteer to be a great charioteer? Well, over the bulk of Aristotle's Ethics, the philosopher lays out a very practical account of this pursuit. Its objective, of course, is wisdom. Right? Knowledge of a life lived in accordance with the true and the good. But what follows as a result of this knowledge is how to realize the true and the good in practice. And that is a very important virtue called prudence. All right, prudence is a virtue through which wisdom informs practice. The outcome of practice, then, is a set of resulting experiences that inform what for Aristotle is the center of the life of wisdom, contemplation. Contemplation is reflection on the true and good in light of experience. In light of the great ideas we discern in our conversations with our peers, as well as the dead, the authors of great books. From this contemplation, perhaps, we arrive at a clear grasp of wisdom, which then informs practice through prudence, the resulting experiences of which inform contemplation. So you see, this is not a destination, but a process moving in a certain direction. And you become wiser and richer or virtuous, right? The result of this process, internalized in our way of life, creates habits. And the Greek word for habit is ethos, from which we get the word ethics, Nikolakian ethics. Virtue is the result of a way of life that creates good habits, literally, and that way of life is wisdom. So, using Aristotle as our starting point, we're now going to proceed from the Greek to the Roman. Right. One of the most succinct comparisons of ancient Greek thought to ancient Roman thought I've ever come across was from political philosophy professor Jan Blitz, right? Blitz contrasts the Greeks from the Romans this way. The Greeks idealize and the Romans reify, right? Whereas the Greek thinker or Greek thought likes to theorize and abstract ideals, Roman thought likes to make ideals practical. So tries to find a way to concretize what in the Greek mind is theoretical and idealized. A great illustration of this is how Greeks and Romans use their artists, right? A great work of Greek art would look something like this. You see that on the right, all right? The Greek artists aspire to realize an expression of idealized beauty that would unlikely have any practical counterpart in real life. But when Rome conquered Greece and brought Greek artists to Rome, what they did was what you see on your right. What's going on there? More real life busts of their ancestors. That's what you're seeing, right? Because to the Romans, ideals were embodied, reified in the lives of their ancestors past, and their aspirations were formed entirely by the desire to live up to the greatness of that past, if not exceeded, all right? Idealization, reification. In the ages that followed classical Greece, what we would call the Hellenistic Roman ages, what began with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, among others, had spun off into numerous different philosophical schools, each claiming the mantle of their predecessors in their own way. But by the time you get to the final centuries of the classical age, the two really dominant philosophies were Neoplatonism and Roman Stoicism. Go ahead. And in their own ways, each of these philosophies reflected the natural disposition of their Greek and Roman counterparts. All right, so in a sense, Neoplatonism was a systemization of Greek idealization, whereas Roman Stoicism was an elaboration of the principles of Roman pragmatic notions of ethics, which is to say, the practical way of life, one who seeks wisdom. And just saying this illustrates what I mentioned earlier by Greek idealism and Roman reification. Neoplatonism and Roman Stoicism are the logical culminating philosophies of these two streams of the West. All right. So Peter Adamson, who hosts this podcast, which I can recommend, called History of Philosophy Without Gaps, makes this really interesting observation that in the last centuries of Rome, the Romans sort of knew they were in decline and looked for philosophies that might help recover a moral foundation in a period of cultural decline. And Neoplatonism and Stoicism were among the most appealing, as was Christianity, right? So there's the big three, and they were all competing for Rome, right? So in some ways, these were competitors to the rising religion of Christianity. And the best way to capture Neoplatonism succinctly is this idea of a ladder. Go ahead. Right? According to Neoplatonists, existence is structured like a ladder, and the goal of one who seeks wisdom is to ascend the ladder. Each step constitutes a higher level of being. And one ascends through a process of contemplation, right? What awaits the fortunate individual who makes it to the top of the ladder is complete harmony with what Plotinus calls the One, which constitutes an existence of complete enlightenment and harmony. This might sound familiar. In contrast to those lower down the ladder, who exist in some sense of dissonance and internal conflict, only a rare few can help to ascend this level. Most live in the state of dissonance. All right. So, in contrast to Neoplatonism, Stoicism focuses on finding a way to make one's life in the world as it is. So, whereas Neoplatonism focuses on ascent, Stoicism focuses on right habits and what we mean when we use this word ethos. Okay? Right. A critical contribution Stoicism makes to what we all will talk about today is this idea of wisdom not just being about a dialectic one carries on with the world, but also a dialectic one carries on within oneself. To the Stoic, part of making one's life in the world entails, among other things, being able to engage in an internal dialogue between the disordered self and that which we know to be wise. This is a direct application of that principle of the charioteer. Only the dialogue is happening within the self between our disordered passions and that which we call wise, which offers a way to order those passions toward what is wise. We would call this inner dialogue. Augustine, who we'll talk about soon, would give this a more familiar name. Any guesses? Soliloquy. Where does that word come from? What do you think of when you hear the word soliloquy? Shakespeare. We're going to hear a soliloquy towards the end of the slideshow. All right, that's right. When we see Shakespeare's characters engaging in a monologue, expressing their thoughts to the crowd, that character is dramatizing an idea that goes directly back to Augustine. It has precedents that go all the way back to Plato, if not Socrates, right? Enter Jerusalem. Right. Whereas Greek and Rome brought idealization and reification, you could say Jerusalem's contribution to the West was revelation. Whereas Greece aspired to conceptualize ever more transcendent ideals, and Rome sought to live up to the ideals of its history, embodied in its ancestors, Jerusalem introduced a religion of the book that was a deposit of the God of the Hebrews in its Christian dispensation of the Christians. If you think about these as different tributaries that feed into the same stream called the West, then the intersection of these three streams would be, I would argue, St. Augustine. All right? Good. Tributary. All right. And these concepts of ascent and inner dialogue will have a new formulation under Augustine, which I'll refer to as ethical poetics. All right. First, let's have a conversation about who this Augustine guy is. All right. Good. All right. Augustine was born in 354 AD in northern Africa of a notoriously devout Carthaginian mom, Saint Monica, and the Numidian father. All right. So, relevant detail is Augustine was quite likely black by our standards. Right. So when we see representations of him is looked that way, that's because it's been medievalized. All right. But I think there's probably like the big five philosophers. So it's probably Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Well, Augustine was somewhere in the big five, right? So this goes to a funny thing about Mediterranean cultures. The associations with skin color doesn't have the baggage that we have. So more than likely, Augustine was black. All right. So it's always just something to keep in the back of your mind. If people start talking about, the Western tradition being Northern European or something, it's actually Mediterranean. And by that, I mean not just Europe, but the Middle East and North Africa, primarily, right? All right. So Augustine described himself in his Confessions as a restless child with a passion for learning, but also for getting into trouble. Thumos again, all right? Quote, my unquiet mind was altogether intent to seek for learning, unquote, Augustine said himself. The young Augustine's appetite for learning drove him to seek answers in the works of thinkers like Plato, Cicero, and the Roman poet Virgil, among others. While a young teacher of rhetoric, Augustine's journey led him to find big answers in Manichaeism, then Neoplatonism, and it was under the influence of the Bishop of Milan, St. Ambrose, that Augustine found a figure whose depth seemed to help him find an understanding of Christianity that reconciled questions that were only incompletely resolved among the other authors he had studied. But what Augustine does in telling this story in his Confessions is beautifully weave together a narrative fabric that includes strands from his philosophical journey through Neoplatonism and Stoicism, his literary journey through figures like the epic poet Virgil, and composes them upon a scaffold of texts from Scripture. What is it that Augustine is telling us in this story he composes for us of his own journey? In a treatise he wrote toward the end of his life called De Musica, or On Music, Augustine argues that, properly understood, life is a narrative composition moving from dissonance to harmony across time, informed by master texts and life narratives that edify the life of the pilgrim. Done right, our life comes to constitute a beautiful work of living narrative poetry that is organically part of a much larger epic about all of us. The Confessions is Augustine's life poem, written for those of us who want to learn from an example to apply to our own life poem. Okay, so what does this look like in practice? Fortunately for us, we have a painting that summarizes this way of life from Rembrandt. All right, this is called The Philosopher in Meditation. And it beautifully combines in one image all the themes we just talked about. All right, so let's see if you can find them. First, where is ascent symbolized? Go ahead. Score one. There you go. Ascent. All right. Next, where is the master text? You see it? It's there. It's next to the window. All right. All right. Third, this is a tough one, but it's there. Where is the inner dialogue symbolized? Anyone want to describe it?
Between the two individuals.
Oh, that's okay. Now I would, all right, this is my interpretation, all right, not authoritative, but I'd say the body language of the philosopher. I think what's going on is an internal dialogue with himself, all right? But I like that idea, it's a very interesting one, all right? And this is a way of life, a process of improving habits. And so we're talking about ethos, just a different way of looking at it, right? All right? So, what is it, according to Augustine, that orders this process of living a life of increasing wisdom and virtue? Augustine gives us a valuable set of categories to help us differentiate such a life from one that is not. Right? Right. Curiosus roughly translates to love of spectacle and refers to all those activities that simply occupy for the sake of amusement and diversion. In a famous scene from Augustine's Confessions, the author relates a story about his friend Alypius, who was pranked by his friends when they physically forced him to go to the gladiatorial games. Alypius, his name, closes his eyes in protest, but then, when he hears the crowd suddenly cheer, he opens his eyes and in that moment sees the bloody spectacle before them. From that moment, becomes addicted to the gladiatorial games. Curiosis is the sort of thing we can engage in, not knowing that at a certain point, curiosis can take possession of us. Studiosis, by contrast, is desire for the pursuit of the things that are most worthy. Author Xenophon, in the book Lost in Thought, calls a life of studiosis one that possesses, the virtue of seriousness. All right, so according to Hitz, whereas curiosis can take possession of us, studiosis is a life dedicated to learning in the best sense. It orders the rest of our desires around that one great desire for what's worth desiring, the true, the good, and the beautiful. Here is how Hitz puts it in her book, Lost in Thought. Augustine's virtue of seriousness, we find, is of key value in our understanding of intellectual life. Intellectual life involves a direction. It draws us on to something more, and then something more, until and if we reach a point where there is no more. Augustine himself is a human being drawn inexorably to the more reality, more depth, more understanding. And the virtue of seriousness, the habitual pursuit of learning, turns out to be ordered by the desire for what matters most. If we share Augustine's confidence that our desire for truth and our ultimate well-being will not come into conflict, what matters most for us will make us flourish. So as I said in the beginning of our presentation, the problem statement of classical education is how do we make ambition, desire, and seek wisdom and virtue? And the answer is to teach in such a way as to disclose the innate beauty of a life lived in accordance with the true and the good. Why such a life is in fact desirable for its own sake. This life is a life of studiosis. All right, third and final section. Any questions at this point? All right. So I want to finish by making what I just covered as vivid as possible to everyone here. What is the best way to make something as memorable as possible? You turn it into a story. After years of trying, it had become increasingly clear for me, despite trying very hard, I was not going to see a classical charter school happen in Pasadena. Pasadena is where I live, by the way. I wanted that for my kids. And so, not knowing a few years later, OCCA was going to be founded, I decided I was going to try to write a survey of Western civilization to read to my kids, so they could at least get some of that education at home, if not at school. I didn't want it just to be about history, but also about its ideas, and so it was important to me that they be exposed to the really important ideas. All right? Among the most important, in my opinion, was what that great work of philosophy we just discussed, Aristotle's Nikolakian ethics. How do you make the Nikolakian ethics accessible to 6-year-olds? I made it into a story. The result was Nicomachus, the boy charioteer. Right? That's Nicomachus. Nicomachus lived in a region far north of the main city-states of Greece called Macedonia. He loved to go to the games with his father, specifically to watch the chariot races. What was it about the chariot races that he liked so much? Well, not only did the chariot races require great daring and courage, but also harmony. A harmony of man, machine, and animal. But this harmony wasn't just innate. It didn't happen naturally on its own. It had to be realized by the talents of the charioteer who needed to achieve this harmony in the moment, taking into account all the peculiar circumstances that his chariot and horses were facing. So, of course, the story is about how Nikolakian learns to become such a charioteer. All right. The reason why I'm sharing this with you isn't because of the metaphor of the chariot. All right, we just covered that. But because of how the boy learns to become a great charioteer. After teaching Nikolakian perseverance and humility through cleaning the stables, his charioteer coach, Mr. Uri, takes Nikolakian to a chariot race where the great charioteer Aristos would be competing. And Mr. Reed tells Nikolakian to watch for something in particular. Aristos' two major competitors, Akrasios and Ellipsos. And upon watching the race, Nikolakian quickly understands why. Because compared to Aristos, Akrasios' weakness was his excess, and Ellipsos' was his deficiency. Whenever there was a chance for Akrasios to pass Aristos in the race, Akrasios took it, whether it was prudent or not. Aristos used that against him. By the end of the race, his horses were exhausted and his chariot had taken significant damage. Ellipsos, in contrast, could be just as skilled as Aristos, but he was too conservative and passed many opportunities that could have changed the outcome of the race. Excellence, the story goes, is about matching one's action according to the virtuous mean that runs between the extremes of excess and deficiency. And how does Mr. Reedy counsel Nikolakian to acquire such a practical skill? Go ahead. Is it familiar? This is a picture of ethos as a charioteer, the picture that Aristotle gives of a life of seeking out virtue. It's one where we engage in activity of contemplation, seeking wisdom, which informs how we come out to accomplish the true and good in practice, which is what we refer to as the virtue of prudence. That gives rise to the experiences that become part of contemplation. And so the process continues as we more closely find the virtuous mean in actual practice. Go ahead. Aristotle has a whole section in his Ethics talking about the different virtues and the respective vices of insufficiency and excess. For instance, if courage is our virtue, what do you think its deficiency is? Courage is our virtue. What is its deficiency? We call someone who has no courage what? Coward. Cowardice. Thank you. It was very courageous of you. All right. What is its excess? This is always an interesting question. We don't think of an excess of courage, but according to Aristotle, what is an excess of courage?
Rashness.
Rashness. Good one. That's a new one. Anything else?
Arrogance.
Arrogance? Okay. Although Aristotle, that's a long story. All right. So recklessness, but rashness is good too. But there's a whole cluster of like words that you use. All right. And so that's just courage. This goes on for 11 virtues in Aristotle's list, right? He has a whole chapter there where he talks about the deficiency and excess, right? So, as educators here at OCC, we're constantly having to make exactly these kinds of adjustments, right? For instance, tell me if this is familiar as parents. As educators, we want a class to be orderly, but not oppressive. Definitely not lax, right? We want the kids to enjoy some degree of agency in their learning, but it needs to be structured. To be excellent at a craft, not unlike charioteering, means to learn through experience, the right balance between all these competing skills. Right? How do we do this? It involves some process of contemplation, prudential acting, informed by some notion of what is true and good, to use the official definition. Some knowledge of life lived in accordance with the true and the good, which is what we mean by the word of wisdom. So if you want to be really precise, A life dedicated to wisdom and virtue is a life dedicated to finding that and combination of virtues that make practice excellent, to finding that mean between excess and efficiency across multiple virtues that combine in a life of excellence. All right. For Aristotle, that mental life that succeeds in combining 11 virtues in practice, each constituting some virtuous mean between excess and efficiency. So this seems pretty abstract. So what does it look like? Go ahead. All right, we're going to see this guy. Fortunately, and I can't tell you how much I can emphasize, how much this is something that can't be overemphasized. Fortunately, we share the same language of one of the greatest dramatists of classical ideas, William Shakespeare. Right? Okay, we kind of share the same language, but William Shakespeare. And here is like a very good example of such a life. Go ahead, Ben. All right. So this is Henry V from the culminating play of Shakespeare's History of the English Kings. All right. So History of the English Kings is 8 plays. All right. And Shakespeare introduces us to many different kinds of bad kings, like Richard III, decadent kings like Richard II, many archetypes along the way representing some combination of excess and deficiency. All right. So in the plays, Henry IV parts 1 and 2, Henry V, Shakespeare shows us how, as a prince, learns to become a great king by finding the virtuous mean of different characters in his life, each representing different critical qualities to being a great leader, but in some form of incompleteness. All right? So he becomes great by learning the qualities, combining them in his actions in such a way that they are properly moderated to become virtues. Key virtues to great leadership. All right? So who are these characters? We anticipated one of them right here. All right. Henry's great rival in Henry IV Part 1 is Henry Hotspur, the Prince of Northumberland. Hotspur's virtue is martial valor, and he possesses it in excess, recklessness, rashness. Right? Rather than virtuous, he is reckless and ends up defeated at the end of the first play because he enters into battle with the king despite being far outnumbered and at great disadvantage. So martial valor is not enough. It must be balanced. Balanced with what? Deliberation. All right. Henry's father, King Henry IV, was a calculating and deliberative as they come, and yet he exhausted himself putting down would-be usurpers like Hotspur and never succeeding in establishing his own authority in the hearts of his people. Deliberation is not enough. Liberality too is necessary. A love for men as they are conduces to being loved by those men in return. We need a little Falstaff in us, but not too much Falstaff. We need to know when to party with our people. But whereas Falstaff was convivial and merry, he was also utterly lacking in martial courage and long-term ambitions. But these were qualities Hal would find embodied in figures like Hotspur and his father, Henry IV. Excellence and virtue in practice, Shakespeare is telling us, is a way of life where one takes ownership of the things that form them. Hal becomes a great king because he recognizes in these incomplete exemplars qualities that with a proper moderation can combine to make greatness and excellence in practice. We are not kings, but this applies every bit as much to us as it did to Hal. To be great human beings means taking ownership of the things that form us, and that is quite literally the true purpose of learning properly understood. To quote Xennius, to read and inquire as a free adult is to take on the awesome responsibility of allowing oneself to be changed. And the purpose of things like this series is to attempt to give you a portion of what that looks like. All right. So I'm going to show you a map of everything we've just covered. All right. So go ahead. All right. Wisdom in its pursuit entails a way of life, balancing contemplation and practice towards an end, which is finding a virtuous mean across different qualities we may find exist in some form of deficiency or excess, but properly attenuated can be made, like Shakespeare shows us now, to inform a life of virtue and even greatness. All right? Whereas for Howe, these influences were figures like Hotspur's father and Falstaff. For us, these figures include drawing from 2,500 years of civilizational memory. Wisdom is a way of life, is a life dedicated to contemplation, wisdom, prudence, to realize wisdom in practice. That gives rise to experiences that are material for further contemplation, and so on. All right. So that involves an inner dialogue consisting of experiences and ideas, helping us to arrive at ways to interpret experiences so that we can grow in wisdom and virtue. And where do these ideas come from? We've provided here a framework so that we as educators in the classical tradition have a broad sketch of the main points of that tradition. All right. So go ahead and hit the next 3 slides. Good. 2 more. All right. So we've literally covered all this ground. All right. We begin in elementary school with a trivia so that we can develop the sophistication to know how to engage with ideas, dialectic, all right? When our students arrive at those critical high school years, okay, that's when the narrative self is formed, and they are ready to engage in a discerning and deep discussion about exactly what qualities are worth emulating in their lives. They're going to read their Shakespeare, right? Among other authors as examples, right? So literature is critical for that, just as critical as history, just as critical as the culture they seek here, just as critical are their teachers, right? It's a big palette of influences. Classical education takes that into account, all right? So this is probably the second most important slide. The first most important is on the very beginning where it shows the young person, the older person, right? This is probably the second. This shows you what classical education is from the inside and how it interacts with all these things to help the student form itself, all right? Next slide. All right. Okay, so the great thing is, all right, this doesn't have just to be a slideshow, okay? Because Shakespeare gives us a whole palette of characters to think about these things, and we're going to talk about 2 of them. I chose these two because they're beautifully symmetrical. All right. Mark Antony is the lieutenant of Julius Caesar, and in Shakespeare's play by the name of Julius Caesar, Caesar is assassinated. And the assassins, led by Brutus, gave Mark Antony one choice. Either Mark Antony had to show solidarity with the assassins, or he was going to be on the wrong end of a sword. Right? So Mark Antony is a very capable person, and he gives one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches called the funeral speech, where he's supposed to, right after Brutus, give this speech mourning the death of Caesar, but doing it in such a way as to express solidarity with Brutus and the others. You can hear a refrain in the speech. Pay attention to the refrain. I'm going to ask you that in the speech. The key thing I would like you to listen for is, what passions is Mark Antony appealing to in his audience? What are the passions you see emerge as a result? So in this speech he's going to give, he's giving a speech to the plebs. All right, these are the salt of the earth folks. These are not lettered people. You'll see that in the play. Ask yourself as you're watching this, what passions he's drawing out of them, why is he leveraging those, and what is his purpose?